Hi everybody, welcome back to Political Science Optional, and let us continue our discussion on theories of state. Now, in the previous lecture, we had basically defined for ourselves, okay, what is a state. We had seen the evolution of state, right? And in the evolution, we had also seen an overall good description about what the state overall entails, right? So all of this we had seen, and now we will come to directly the topics that are mentioned in the syllabus, right, from the liberal theory of the state to neoliberal theory of the state, Marxist theory of state, post-colonial theory of state, okay, feminist theory of state, all these theories which are directly mentioned for us in the syllabus, we will have a look at, right? So this is going to be again an interesting topic. The first part of this lecture one you've already seen, and today my focus largely will be first again emphasizing to you origin of the state and the different theories around it. Okay, then today we will see liberal theory, neoliberal theory. Now this again will be a revision because major part we've already done in ideologies, but sometimes a very specific question comes that what is the liberal or let's say the neoliberal theory of state. So this will help you answer it, right? Now Marxist theory of state. Now this is a very good topic to understand. Many times students have a very scattered understanding, right? And I've always maintained, right, from our discussion on even Gramsci and even Althusser. So I've given you some broad perspectives to think about. This is what we will continue. And today I'll tell you different perspectives of state within the Marxist perspective. This also will be very handy for you in paper 2A, right? Because in paper 2A, again, you will hear about Marxist theory of IR, international relations. This you will directly then make a connection, right? This we do. If time permits, I will also take, let's say, post-colonial state, but I have a lot of elaboration on Marxist theory, right? Otherwise, of course, the post-colonial theory and the feminist and by the way, pluralist we have already done. So whatever discussion we had in the previous class, okay, monistic theory versus the pluralistic theory which we had done in the previous part, that is more than sufficient for you, right? The work of MacIver, Lasky being a moderate pluralist, MacIver being an extremist pluralist, right? Both of these things we had seen, fine. So I'm just putting a tick mark so that you are also clear that pluralist, because we've already done it, right? There is no point of repeating that. Pluralist theory of state and its scholars, and whenever you do this topic, you will compare this with the monist theory, right? Think of Hobbes, Austin, Bodin and their work, fine. So this we are going to discuss now. If we recall very clearly how the state has evolved, from there only I can bring in the origin of state, right? And this topic is also important for our understanding in general. Now, generally speaking, okay, again try to recall and think of, let's say, Plato. Let's say if I even talk about, let's say, Aristotle, right? First of all, remember for them, what was a state? State was an organic entity, right? In fact, if you recall, we say that the reasoning and logic of Aristotle is what? Aristotle says that it is in the teleology of man to be ruled under the state. And teleology simply means here purpose. The purpose of man is to be ruled under a state, right? And he says that chronologically man came before the state, but logically the state is prior to an individual, and that was a very important statement that we had seen. Okay, so I'm just writing that statement, just building around our discussion, right? Aristotle says state is prior to individual. Plato says state is individual writ large. So for these thinkers, state is a natural entity, state is an organic entity, right? Now, although very different in time, but very similar in the idea, is somebody again like Hegel. Now, Hegel also happens to be an idealist. What does Hegel say? Hegel says state is the march of God on earth. For Hegel also, state is natural, state is desirable. In that sense, organic entity, right? Now, we are also aware that as time moved on, there are different theories that we read about. Okay, so for example, when we move along, okay, you also hear about something known as, remember, DRT, divine rights theory, right? Second, if I even talk about Aristotle, etc., think of family, multiple families, and ultimately state, right? Aristotle says state is what? A family of families. Individual is prior to state, right? What does he talk about? He talks about kingship in general. But there's also a kingship theory of state, which even Aristotle would subscribe to, right? There is divine rights theory, that state is the embodiment, a reflection of the divine. This was seen more in medieval times. All right, we also have seen this. Do we have any other theory, right? When I say kingship, here I can have slightly bifurcation. For example, a patriarchal view, that within family, within that, the state is the instrumentation or reflection of patriarchy, right? In the male dominated societies, the state comes reflecting the supremacy of males. That is a patriarchal theory of society. And in that same sense, you can also have a matriarchal theory of society. Patriarchal as well as matriarchal theory of society, right? This would be one of these aspects. So when I say state is prior to individual, please remember that quote. Think of patriarchal as well as the matriarchal aspects, right? Now, there is a DRT, that is divine rights theory. Now, there is a very important theory that most of you are aware of. Social contract theory, right? And when I say social contract, your mind goes to Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau. Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau. In fact, when your mind goes to Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau, what do you think? That ultimately all these important works, right, related to how the state is getting created, right? So there, the idea is, what is the social contract? Social contract is between people. Okay, so people ultimately create a state. And if people create a state, then the state is not natural. This is what? It is mechanistic. So then this also becomes an important perspective to know, right? So what do we see? There is an organic theory of state. There is a mechanistic theory of state, also exemplified in the works of, or seen in social contract, right? This also is there. Then there is another theory which we can again point out and mention, right? Which is also known as, let's say, the evolutionary, or I can even say the historical theory, right? Now this theory is propounded by, so we have seen certain people, for example, who is very prominent here. So you have seen already the work of this MacIver. Try to think. MacIver says the concept of service state. People obey and, let's say, respect the state, obey the orders. Why? Because the state commands, because it serves. That is the main point that they argue, right? Now, evolutionary theory is very easy to understand, that state has been created gradually over a period of time because of the necessities of man. Okay, so here state has evolved gradually, which means socially, economic conditions, in all these factors, keeping this in context, this has led to the evolution of state, right? So this is again something that is important to understand here for us, right? That what is ultimately, so what is evolutionary and historical aspect? That state has evolved gradually over a period of time, and there are many factors, right, which have led to the creation of the state, right? Now, in the theories that I've told you, two theories are the most academically quoted, the most relevant ones, and these two happen to be, one is the evolutionary theory, so I'm just putting a tick mark, and of course one is your social contract theory, the most accepted and the most cited theories. But that does not mean that we can not say that there is a divine rights theory and there are other theories. Other theories also exist, okay, but not as popular with respect to the origin of state. Fine. So in a couple of books, if you read, for example, if you read Origin of State, they may only just mention social contract and these two theories, right? But let's say you read any other text, you let's say read more and you let's say go through some other documents, you may also find some other theories. So don't get confused. I'm just putting a star mark because these are more academically accepted theories. That is the only distinction and the difference in this part, right? And this is related to the origin of the state, right? Fine. So here I'll just give you a very short write-up so that you also understand, and then we'll move to the very interesting aspects of different theories of state, right? Write the heading origin of state, right? Origin of state. Okay, so right, the origin of state, the origin of the state has been one of the oldest questions. The origin of state has been one of the oldest questions in political philosophy. It has been one of the oldest questions in political philosophy. Full stop, right? Different theories rooted in religion. Different theories rooted in religion. So when I say religion, you also have this particular aspect, right? And we will be writing divine rights theory, etc. So different theories rooted in religion, comma kinship, religion, comma kinship, comma contract, comma contract, comma contract, and evolution have attempted to explain how political authority first emerged, and why individuals accepted it. How political authority first emerged and how individuals accepted it. Okay, number one, you can write the divine/religious theory. Divine/religious theory. So in that you can just write, when we'll write this in point-wise manner, not much to elaborate, right? You'll understand. Right, state is created by God. State is created by God, comma. The ruler is God's representative. Ruler is Indian representative. Now, when you say this, your mind should also see this theory is present both in WPT, Western political thought, as well as IPT. If you think of Manusmriti, right? I've told you there is a quasi-contractual state. The state also has cosmic origin. Think of Rith, all the moral order, etc. Right? So we've written state is created by God and ruler is God's representative. Full stop. Right? Seen in medieval Europe. Seen in medieval Europe. Medieval Europe, comma, divine rights of king, the divine rights of king, and also in Indian political thought, and you can bracket में you can write Manusmriti, right? You can write Manusmriti. Okay, second, write organic theory of state. This is important. Right, organic theory of state. Organic theory of state. Okay. Now, again, just to emphasize on the word, we can directly always contrast this theory with mechanistic theory of state, right? So imagine, for example, the state is created purely mechanically out of design, or state is created by a force. Here, the state is organic. Okay, organic means it is natural. It is like an organism, and this theory will be supported by Plato, Aristotle, and even later by Hegel, right? So that is one. State is just like an organism. It is natural, it desirable. It is how it evolves. So we are seeing this theory because I will be contrasting this theory with again things like force and mechanistic theory. Social contract in that sense is not very organic. Okay, and whenever you have to compare, for example, if there is a statement which talks about state is prior to individual, right? This statement is not just only about Aristotle. This statement is more on state. How is the conception of state in the times of Aristotle more important for us, right? Now, so please write here the organic theory of state. The organic theory of state the organic theory of state is one of the it is one of the earliest explanations one of the earliest explanations of the state's origin and nature. State's origin and nature, full stop. It views the state not as an artificial creation. It views the state not as an artificial creation based on contract or force. We will be seeing both of them very shortly, contract and force. It is not an artificial creation based on contract or force, but a natural, underline natural, but a natural, comma, living organism, but a natural, comma, living organism that grows and evolves that grows and evolves like any biological entity. That grows and evolves like any biological entity. Full stop. Right? This theory, this theory was developed by ancient thinkers such as Plato and Aristotle. This theory was developed by ancient thinkers such as Plato and Aristotle. Comma, later expanded by medieval Christian philosophers. Later expanded by medieval Christian philosophers and modern scholars like hmm, and the later modern scholars like, and now we'll write, of course, Hegel, like Hegel and Herbert Spencer. Hegel, Herbert Spencer. Okay, Herbert Spencer. Now, we've written some of these quotes. These quotes will also come in our write-up. Okay, so now please write. Now, so one overall introduction, we've seen what is the theory and who are the scholars associated. Now come to the next paragraph, right? According to this theory, state is an organic whole. According to this theory, state is an organic whole, comparable to the human body. State is an organic whole comparable to the human body. Comparable to the human body. State is an organic whole comparable to the human body. Okay, so here you can just write, the individuals are like organs of the body. The individuals are like the organs of the body. The individuals are like organs of the body. Full stop. The state is like the body itself. The state is like the body itself, greater than the sum of its parts. The state is like the body itself, greater than the sum of its parts. Okay. Now, right, Aristotle had said, state is prior to the individual. Aristotle had said state is prior to the individual. We've already seen that particular interpretation in good detail, so I'll not be repeating that, but you know that what did he say? You have an individual that creates a family. Family again leads to a village. Village ultimately creates a state. So there's a progression that happens. This is ultimately a part of organic theory of state. Okay. So you can write, Aristotle viewed the polis, and we've also seen, and in fact the polis is your city state. Okay, so when you break down the term political, okay, political, the very simple meaning of political comes from the Greek word polis, P-O-L-I-S, and P-O-L-S simply means a city state, right, representing collective wisdom, decision making, right. So right, Aristotle famously said, and this also we've written, the state is prior to an individual, right. He viewed the polis, P-O-L-I-S, he viewed the polis as a natural institution, arising from the evolution of family, to a village, to a village, and ultimately to a state. And we had drawn something like this, if you recall in the class, that family, so individual, family, village, and ultimately this state. And this is how we had progressed, right? So family, village, and state. Right? Hegel called the state the march of God on earth. Hegel called the state the march of God on earth, representing the highest expression of ethical life. representing the highest expression of ethical life. The highest expression of ethical life. Okay, this is the overall idea of organic theory of state. And when I compare and contrast with social contract theory, again, you will understand better, right? So remember the organic theory of state. Overall, the idea that state is just like an organism, how it evolves, it's a natural entity, okay? So this we have seen. Now let's come back to the other theories of state. Before jumping back to social contract and other theories, again, a couple of small theories are there. You can just write that. So one right is force theory. Another theory is force. And here the idea is simply that force. So state is only created for wars, conquests. Okay, so only from that angle the state is created. So just write state originates. State originates from conquests and coercion. State originates from conquests and coercion. Full stop and right. It is useful in explaining ancient empires. Not too much to explain here. Useful in explaining ancient empires. That is the force theory. Another theory that I've written here, I'll just write it again, kinship theory, which is nothing, or this is also the patriarchal theory. And because I've mentioned patriarchal, so another thing can be matriarchal. So even for this, just for your understanding, one line, this individually would not be asked. But because we are seeing the term origin of the state, you should be aware that there are other theories which can possibly explain how the state comes to being, right? Although these are very small theories, which is why hardly we're writing 1 or 2 lines each. So patriarchal kinship, you can write the state evolved. The state evolved from family, put a dash, clan. The state evolved from a family, clan, tribe, village. The state evolved from the family, clan, tribe, village. And here also just write it is supported by Aristotle. Aristotle, supported by Aristotle. We are talking of kinship, your patriarchal theory, supported by Aristotle. For this matriarchal theory, just write some early societies were matrilineal. Some early societies were matrilineal. The state evolved from mother right. The state evolved from mother right. Right, supported by MacLennan. Supported by MacLennan. Supported by MacLennan and Morgan. So these are smaller theories, right? MacLennan, there is Morgan, who talk about the other theory. So we have seen patriarchal theory, that is the kinship theory, and there is a matriarchal theory of state that we have seen, right? So this is what we have seen overall. Okay. Now write the heading social contract theory. So now the other 2 remaining theories we will see, right? Right. The social contract theory. Write the heading social contract theory. So of course now we will write the social contract theory. So put that heading and write state is created by the consent of the individuals. State is created by the consent of the individuals, and therefore state is a man-made institution. State is created by the consent of the individuals, and therefore the state is a man-made institution. Okay, and whenever we say about social contract, to explain it, you can always say that it aims to prevent, let's say, the anarchy, okay, or it aims to bring political order, which was not possible in a state of nature, right? So, whenever we explain the social contract, that why people want to create a state, why they create a state, because the state of nature, there is no political order, there is chaos. For Hobbes, it is then very extreme. Life is nasty, poor, brutish, solitary, short. Yes or no? That is what you'll write, right? That is why state becomes a man-made institution, right? So that is what we'll write here. Right? Then you can write this theory, which means the social contract theory, right? Social contract theory, this theory explains why, this theory explains why orderly and civilized existence, this theory explains why orderly and civilized existence is impossible in the absence of government. It is impossible in the absence of government, but also to advance a theory of nature of state power, but also to advance a theory of nature of state power. Of state power, nature of state power. Okay. Now, right? The SC theory, which means the social contract theory, counters the idealistic theory. And by the way, if a question says idealistic theory of state, the organic theory of the state is idealistic theory of state. So in the organic theory, also write / idealistic theory. That state is natural, desirable, right? So normally we use the term organic, but even if you can use the term idealistic. Idealistic, right? Okay. Now, so right, this social contract theory counters the idealistic theory, and it also opposes the divine origin of state. It also opposes divine origin of state. Full stop, right? Social contract theory is seen in the works of Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau. This we already know, we've seen so many times. Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau. Okay, again, try to recall. For Hobbes, what did we say? That the state ultimately is the ultimate sovereign, because in a state of nature, the life was solitary, poor, brutish, nasty, short. Whereas, in the case of Locke, the state ultimately, or through the social contract, people safeguard their life, liberty, freedom. And in the case of Rousseau, it is the general will which is exemplified by the state through a social contract, right? And please remember, when we are saying, remember the last class, R.M. McIver, the general will is not the general will of the state, it is the general will of the people. And tied to this is the idea that the state commands because it serves. Very two important concepts, right? So just a very quick recall of Hobbes, Locke and Rousseau, what we need to know about them, right? This is something we have seen. All right. Okay. Now write the heading evolutionary theory. So this is, I think, more or less sufficient for you to know. Write the evolutionary theory. Evolutionary theory. Right. State is not, right? State is not created. State is not created. It means state is not a creation of one single moment. It says, the name is evolution. Something has evolved over a period of time. It means gradually the state has evolved based on the conditions of the time, right? So here, right, state is not created, comma, it evolved gradually. It evolved gradually due to social, comma, economic and political changes. Social, economic and political changes. Right? This theory is supported by McIver and Gettle. McIver and Gettle. To highlight that the state has been a result of multiple associations. The state has been a result of multiple associations. Full stop, right? Multiple factors like, now what did we say? That state has gradually evolved. So which factors have been very instrumental in its evolution? That is what we'll write, right? So the factors involve, right, kinship, comma, property, and by the way, this will include everything. It will I can also say war, I can also say religion, everything, because it's an evolution over a period of time. So factors involve kinship, property, war, religion, need for political order, and economic cooperation. And economic cooperation. Right? So this first of all covers the very first part which I wanted to cover, origin of state. Many times students directly jump to liberal theory of state. Okay, and even, by the way, sometimes in interview, UPSC interview, you will see a question whether the state is organic or mechanistic, and sometimes you're dumbfounded knowing from which area are they asking you question. Okay, and this was, by the way, one of the questions asked to me also in the UPSC interview, right? I had back then also had read about it, so at least this question I was able to answer confidently. But just I'm sharing my anecdote, and let's say whenever you see some of the transcripts, you will see sometimes a question directly on the origin of state. Okay, so this is again a topic not explicitly mentioned, but we should know about it. Fine. Now we have seen origin of state, right? Now the next two topics directly there in the syllabus, but for us relatively easier. Why? Because we have already covered them in detail in ideologies, right? We are talking about liberal and neoliberal theory of state, right? Now, how do we cover it? And now, other theories of state, how will we be covering it? I'll just tell you now first. Okay, see, let's say there is any X, here is any theory of state. What should be the framework for you to understand it, right? Now, number one will be a very basic thing. Let's define it, which for us can be what? Nothing but the intro. So let's say if I say liberal theory of state, how can I define that in 1 or 2 lines, right? Second thing is, if applicable, see its evolution. Now, evolution, this part we have covered in ideology, right? So this will not be a big challenge. We should know the key thinkers, right? And directly the key features. And here please remember, liberalism as an ideology, we've already done it. In fact, the phases of liberalism. The question is on liberal theory of state, right? So what does liberal theory of state talk about? I should know. Okay, this thing, this thing, this thing, this thing. Let's say these are the core features, right? Then a very important point will be criticism, right? Now, again, a simple point I'm telling you. If you're not able to recall criticism immediately, please now develop this habit of thinking with your syllabus. If it is liberal, it has to be criticized by Marxist. That will always be there. And you can again further criticize it by other theories of the syllabus. Bring in the feminist critique, bring in the post-colonial critique. Okay? And as time goes on and as you revise your notes more and more, you will see the similar pattern. Even if we do the theories of IR, let's say we've done the realist theory of IR, it will be criticized by liberal theory of IR, feminist theory of IR, Marxist theory of IR, etc. Right? Now, while we should know the criticism of each theory or ideology, but in your answer, it would not be possible to include all the criticism, which is why this is a template that you will follow, right? Which means you will have a basic definition, how it is evolving, thinkers, features, criticism, etc. That will be very crucial for you. And lastly, a conclusion, and here I am also linking it to a relevance or an influence. So, for example, if I say liberal theory of state, I'll also bring it, what is the current status of liberal theory of state? Is there a criticism, etc. or not? We'll also examine that. Right? So, this is generally a way to understand an ideology, right? That is the first point. That is why I've written X theory of state. Okay? So, for you, this you should definitely, without this, the answer is hollow. This is more for our understanding, right? How the theory, and especially let's say liberalism, we have seen classical liberals, okay, moving to modern liberalism, neoliberalism, and the most recent times, let's say social liberalism, for example, right? But you should know to understand the concept overall behind it. But depending on the nature of the question, what is to be elaborated and in which regard, this is how, and this will come with certain practice. I hope first this part is clear to you, right? Now, if we think of liberalism as an ideology, and we have seen its evolution, right? We saw how classical liberals moved and ultimately this paved way for modern liberalism, which led to neoliberalism, right? And all this distinction, thinkers, etc. we've already seen. Question is liberal theory of state, fine? And separately neoliberal theory of state is also mentioned in the syllabus, okay? So that means I have to talk about number one, now whenever you will talk about liberal theory of state, you have to think broad. Because if the question simply writes liberal theory of state, you cannot limit your answer only to classical liberals. You have to have a broader idea, which means generally liberal theory of state is known for which attributes. However, if the question is only, and this is a separate topic of the syllabus, neoliberal theory of state, then you are exactly clear, they are only talking about this part. Yes? So sometimes the students have a doubt, sir, if there is a 20 marker only mentioning liberal theory of state, should I also include neoliberalism? The answer is yes, you can include neoliberalism, right? Because when you explain and when you open the liberal theory of state, you can go back to neoliberalism. Whereas, if the question is specific, Neoliberal theory of state, even 10 marker, 15 or even a 20 marker, let's say. You have to stick around this. That is how the difference in the focus of your point is going to be, which is why I have again drawn to you the whole evolution part, how these theories have evolved. So that is a very basic, crucial part that you have to understand here. Okay, now again let's quickly try to recall. When I say liberal theory of state, think of John Locke, the father of liberalism. Think of Mill, Adam Smith, all these thinkers, the classical liberals. यहाँ पे modern liberalism में we are reminded again of T.H. Green, etc., who talked about the state should also have welfare role. Why? Classical liberals came under a lot of criticism, right? For example, Sumner saying that a drunkard in the gutter is right or is in a right place or is in a place where they should be. What is that? That is a very specific element. Then when we said neoliberalism, so neoliberalism came, why? Because it said the welfare part, the state trying to do both. The Keynesian economics is not very sustainable in the long run, and this will talk about market fundamentalism. Hayek, Nozick, Friedman, all these are very important personalities. So here the focus will be very different. So neoliberalism talks about, let's say, the Washington consensus, okay, free markets, market fundamentalism, okay, reducing the role of the state. It does not want a nanny state, right? Which is why we say something like TINA, T-I-N-A. There is no alternative. All of this is just so that you are able to recall some of the important elements, okay? Because these two topics we've done in a good detail. Now, only we need to have some precise content so that if a specific question is there on the theory of state, you should be able to write, okay? Now, so here first write the heading liberal theory of state, okay, because here not much to explain, only some important parts are there. So what we'll write it, we'll explain what the theory is, we'll tell the key thinkers, we'll tell what the state is ultimately made about, criticism, and then we are done. And same I'll do for neoliberal, because here it is relatively smaller in scope, okay? So first heading for you is the liberal theory of state, and the notes you are writing now are in a very structured format. Liberal theory of state, okay? So first part may just write the definition of it, right? The liberal theory of state, the liberal theory of state emerges from social contract thinkers, like Locke, comma, later developed by Bentham, comma, J.S. Mill, Kant. Liberal theory of state emerges from social contract thinkers like Locke. Remember Locke, the father of liberalism. PYQ of 20 markers also, 2018. Later developed by Bentham, comma, J.S. Mill, Kant, okay, comma, Adam Smith, full stop, right? Then right, second, right, it views the state, and every word is important here. It views the state as neutral. This word will be very important. It views the state as neutral. In your margins, right, they are saying the state is neutral. What will the Marxists say? Marxists say that state is the instrument of bourgeois class. State is never neutral. And if the state appears to be neutral, it is only a facade. It is only false consciousness, right? And that is again a perspective we'll see in good detail, right? So here you can just write that it views the state as neutral, comma, minimal. Every word is important. Now, when I say minimal, try to recall, Locke had imagined what? A night watchman state. And why is all of this important? See, liberalism as an ideology will talk about liberty, maximum liberty for the individual. How can individual have more liberty when the state's power is limited? If the state has too much of power, individual liberty will always be curtailed, right? So they imagine the state to be neutral, right? State is minimal, And when the state is minimal, this will also, so when there's a night watchman state, of course, it allows for property, and ultimately it also, because it is non-interventionist, it does not interfere in the market, which is also what Adam Smith had imagined, right? It also helps in capitalism, entrepreneurship, private capital growth. So it views the state as neutral, comma, minimal, and a rights protecting authority, and a rights protecting authority, and a rights protecting authority created to safeguard individual freedom, created to safeguard individual freedom, created to safeguard individual freedom. Okay, now this is there. Now just on these parts we will have a quick elaboration. So here just write down key features, or you can even write core themes. We have had a habit of writing core themes, so whatever heading, so that means your answer should have these points, right? And I'm going to again talk about neutral, minimal, and all of that. So these are the ultimate core features. Okay, so right, the core features. So number one is, right, state as a neutral empire. State as a neutral empire. Right, इसी में just write mini points. State protects life, comma, liberty and property. In bracket you can write lock. State protects life, liberty and property. Lock. Right, with इसी में right, with impartial adjudication. See, we are saying state is the neutral empire. State is not taking any side. If state is impartial, what will this lead to? Rule of law. Right, and the rule of law is also a very important component of the liberal state, right? So, right, with impartial adjudication, the state ensures rule of law and predictability. With impartial adjudication, state ensures rule of law and predictability. Predictability. Second, right, minimal state. Second, right, minimal state. Now here, just for your understanding, I'll again tell you, when I say minimal state, think of Locke. And Locke said what? Locke is the father of liberalism. And around that time there was Hobbes. What did Hobbes say? Hobbes say, and by the way, Hobbes is also, we know, is a social contract theorist. But Hobbes will say the sovereign has all the authority. Right? And Hobbes will never talk about a limited government. Hobbes will talk about an absolutist government. Now, in an absolutist government, can we really have all the laws and liberties? It will not be possible. Okay? So, when I'm saying minimal state, right, Locke rejected the idea of absolute sovereign. Locke rejected the idea of absolute sovereign and argued that the state exists to protect the natural life, state exists to protect the natural rights of life, comma, liberty and property. Of life, liberty and property. Life, liberty and property. Full stop, right? This was a significant departure, and this is a comparative perspective. I'm comparing now. This is a significant departure from Hobbes' absolutist state. This is a significant departure from Hobbes' absolutist state. Significant departure from Hobbes' absolutist state. Right, full stop. Now, within this point in minimal state, right? Right, night watchman state. Night watchman state, bracket me, you can write Locke prevents arbitrary authority. Night watchman state prevents arbitrary authority and protects individual autonomy. And individual autonomy. Protects individual autonomy, right? Second point. So, first point was, we said state is a neutral empire. Second was the minimal state. You can also think of in limited government. Okay. Now, third, right, consent. Again, same thing also Locke has highlighted. In the social contract, consent is very important, right? Consent. So, third point is consent and legitimacy. See, what all points have we seen? One, state is a neutral empire, not empire, oh, I should write umpire, which means independent adjudicator. Second, overall, minimal state, which also, again, we've seen the idea of night watchman state. Right, now we are writing the third point. A very important point of liberal state is consent and overall legitimacy. We can, in making notes, we can write this and, but when you are writing answers, please be very sure you use the full form. Okay. Right. So, consent and legitimacy mein you can write. And again, just try to recall, we just saw divine rights of state. In the divine rights, is there any consent of the individuals? No, there is no consent of the individuals. Right? People have to obey because it is ultimately the reflection of God or the divine. That is the difference here, right? So you can write, the state derives legitimacy the state derives legitimacy from consent of the governed, comma, not divine right, full stop, right? It is the social contract, that creates political obligation. It is the social contract that creates political obligation. Social contract that creates political obligation. Political obligation. The social contract that creates political obligation. Okay, then you can write fourth point, and this is also a very important point if when we've done a lot of discussion that ultimately who is at the core of liberal society? It is the individual. Whereas societies are at the core of, let's say, a socialist or a Marxist society, they will think of social collective welfare. In liberalism, it is the individual. Their autonomy is very important. So the fourth point that you will write is individualism. Individualism. Okay. Now, I'll again just tell you. See, this is an individual. What does individual want? Let's say freedom of speech and expression, which is ultimately what? It is a part of their rights. Now, in liberalism, you want to expand this as much as possible, the rights of individual. Liberalism is the big ideology. Within liberalism, you have a liberal theory of state. Now, if you want to expand the right of individuals, you want to protect the individuals from who? You want to protect the individuals from the state. Which means in a liberal state, ultimately the state does not want to take up individual liberty. How? Ultimately through limited government. What limits the power or arbitrariness of the government? Ultimately, it is the constitution, and all these concepts you also see in polity. We see this in constitution. Why? Because the constitution is ultimately written. It limits the power. It talks about separation of powers. Yes, yes. And similarly, within constitution, let's say we have fundamental rights, and mostly we see fundamental rights talk about negative liberty. What is negative liberty? That if I reduce the power of state, right, it means individuals are free to do whatever they want. Whereas positive liberty is if the state creates, let's say, hospitals, etc. State's action increases my liberty, that is positive liberty. Negative liberty is if state takes more action, my liberty is getting reduced. Again, a very important feature, core point. Fine. So what we're trying to say, because you now have to think from a state perspective. So liberal theory of state has to enable individualism. How? By limiting the state itself. Which is why rule of law, which is why separation of powers always are a very core feature of liberal theory of state. So again, liberalism is an overarching ideology. Within that, there is a liberal theory of state, which means the core themes of liberalism ultimately should be implemented or reflected through the liberal theory of state. Okay, fine. So here, right, for individualism, just one more line. This explanation is only so that you again understand this whole topic well. Right? Individual is the basic unit of political analysis. Individual is the basic unit of political analysis. Individual is the basic unit of political analysis. Full stop, right? Rights are pre-political and inherent. Very important keywords. Rights are pre-political, inherent. Now, what is the meaning of pre-political? Again, is tied to the idea of, let's say, natural rights. Now, two things. According to the legal theory, if the state creates rights, then only you have rights. But here the idea is the rights exist because you are a man, or let's say you are a person. What is the idea of natural rights? Simply because everybody is a human, everybody has rights. It means even when the state was not existing, you had life, right to life, liberty, property. But now we've created a state so that these rights are protected. So again, this is the term pre-political, inherent. Rights are pre-political, inherent. Okay, and the last point, right? Pluralism. Okay. In fact, I told you Locke spoke of toleration, that how diversity is maintained and respected in plural societies is through toleration. Okay. So fifth, right? Fifth point is pluralism. Fifth is pluralism. So here you can write in pluralism, the liberal state ensures diversity through toleration, comma, separation of powers, comma, free media and civil society. Free media and civil society. Free media and civil society, right? So again, just see what is the structure. We saw what is liberal theory of state. First we saw it is simply the state is what? Neutral. The state is minimal, protects the rights of people. Who gave this theory? Prominent people being, let's say, Locke, Adam Smith, some of the important people we have seen. So we've seen what it is, who are the thinkers. Now we've elaborated on the core features. We've seen 5 features, broadly speaking, of liberal theory of state. Fine. Right from, and we've elaborated that what is the meaning of neutral arbiter, what is the meaning of minimal in that matter, right? What is about consent, individualism, okay? And lastly, we just saw pluralism and how it ensures pluralism. Fine. So if we go by the framework that I had shared, this we have seen, thinkers we have seen, features we have seen. Evolution is a broad part of liberalism, that also you know. Now the last remaining piece of the puzzle, criticism and conclusion. Fine. Now write the heading criticism, okay, and you will get a fair idea. I'll try to include at least the topics or the points mentioned in the syllabus, starting with the Marxist theory of state, okay. And whatever points we have seen in the features, somehow or the other, I'll link that and then I'll criticize it. Fine. Now, keep the key features in your mind. First point, directly you can criticize. For example, liberal says state is neutral arbiter. Marxist will say state is not neutral, it is only pretending to be neutral. And in some cases, it does not even pretend to be neutral. It directly helps the bourgeois. That will be one, right? Second, so one criticism, let's say I have given you a Marxist criticism, fine. Second can be, let's say, okay, let me talk about feminist criticism also. This is a criticism you will also see. Now, feminist criticism, how? When it talks about individuals, right, it talks more about males, it talks more about political equality, it does not include social and economic aspects. So women concerns have not been done very well. In the liberal theories, in fact, in the liberal societies, you know, that women did not have a right to vote until very recently. It was only, let's say, the suffragette movement of UK, the Seneca Falls Convention that we saw in feminism. Then only there is a collective conscience about the women cause. So that means liberal theory of state has its own challenges which the feminists have exposed. That will be one criticism. Then think of excessive focus on individuals. That means community will be diluted, right? Second, if there is too much of individualism, solidarity and collectivism will be challenged. Now, liberals will always say individuals are the most important. There are communitarians, and we will see communitarians in more detail in Rawls' theory of justice. But just think, communitarians say man is not an isolated individual, because when you say man is an individual, you are also saying everybody is isolated, they can exist on their own. But they will say man is not an island or an isolated island, they are a part of the continent, right? So what do communitarians say? Michael Sandel, Michael Walzer, they say that the idea of individualism, okay, is a hollow idea. It does not happen in practice. Man is also social in nature, is a part of the community. You cannot ignore that part. That will also be criticism. And another criticism you will understand better after I have done what is post-colonial meaning. But if I give you one term, fine. Right now I am giving you a very simplistic explanation. Possibly in the next class I will be able to cover this topic in more detail. See, let's say if I want to give a post-colonial critique. First of all, let's understand this, right? Now, we know that the word was under imperialism, colonialism, which means, let's say, Britain, France have had their colonies. Imperialism, there was a lot of conquest wars, right? So as to take more territory, more resources, more people. Now, because of this, many colonies were there. Colonies were dependent, and ultimately colonies fought for their freedom. We had to fight for our freedom for almost a prolonged period of time. Then Africa, Southeast Asia, many other, right? So the moment these colonies got independence, did they totally retain their old existing form? No, there was a challenge here. First of all, the theories that you read, let's say liberal theory of justice or liberal theory of state, liberal theory and any of these theories are Eurocentric, which means they will think of Europe as the ideal type. So two things are hidden here. One is they think of Europe as the ideal type. That means they do not recognize other Eastern societies to be doing well. One. Second, the interpretation of them are not applicable to the third world countries or the countries which recently got freedom. This is one of the strong critiques of post-colonial theory, right? Another issue, so one is this, it talks about existing theories being Eurocentric, very biased in nature. Another issue, what is the next issue here? The huge element of legacy. For example, even in India, for example, when we created our constitution, we borrowed a lot of what was already there in Government of India Act 1935. A lot of old laws that we have, maybe suited for British and their times, but we are still carrying that legacy, right? So that is also a negative part which the post-colonial society highlights. So what the point post-colonialist or the post-colonial scholars will highlight is that this theory is not very much applicable to all the countries, especially the third world countries and the countries which have recently been decolonized. Because their experiences versus what this predicts, individualism and all of that, it is society specific also. It is context specific also. That becomes very important. Right? So, now write the heading criticism. And in fact, I will do this post-colonialism in far more detail with you because it's a specific topic in our syllabus. But I think till here it should be sorted, right? Now, write criticism, write Marxists. Put a dash and write state is not neutral. State is not neutral, comma, it serves the capitalist class interest. State is not neutral, it serves capitalist class interests. It serves the capitalist class interest. Full stop. Second, write feminists. Feminists. For feminists, please write the liberal state ignores structural inequalities. The liberal state ignores the structural inequalities. Just to add more weight in the bracket, now you can write Okin. We have seen Susan Moller Okin. Okay. Third, write communitarians. Communitarians. Right, overemphasis on individual. Overemphasis on individual ignores. Overemphasis on individual ignores community and common good. It ignores community and common good. In the bracket, you can write Sandel. Michael Sandel, Michael Walzer, etc. We will again read more about them in the unit 3, that is justice. So after this unit, I'll move to unit number 1, that is political theory. After that, I'll come to justice. So again, we'll see communitarians in more detail then. Okay. This is communitarians. So we've seen 3: Marxist, feminists, communitarians, and the last one, right? Post-colonial. Post-colonial. Put a dash and write. Right? It assumes Western historical experiences as universal. It assumes Western historical experiences as universal. As universal. As universal, right? Okay, now one more thing. If you still want, just say, right, that if you want to add even more detail, let's say if you're talking of key features, you can still further segregate your answers into this part. Give example of any classical liberal. If you want to quote any specific point, you can do that. Modern liberals, take T.H. Green, right? The idea of welfare state, idea of positive liberty, that also is one of the features of liberal part. But this will be more helpful if, let's say, the question is on 20 marks on liberal theory of state. If it is 10 or 15, what we have done is more than sufficient for you to write. But let's say you have to fill those 4 pages, then you can bring the evolution part. This is where this will be handy. Okay? Just to write this part, a couple of things and how to write it, just write overall. Right, classical liberals like, so criticism etc. we've seen, fine. Right, classical liberals, and this part can be added to the features of the state, right? Look, classical liberals, bracket mein, you can write Adam Smith, comma Locke / Bentham, any of these people. Classical liberals and neoliberals, like Nozick, Hayek. I often mix both of them and I create Nayak. I should be writing, okay, right, Nozick, Hayek. So both classical liberals and neoliberals support a night watchman / minimal state. This will even add more precision to your points. Okay, then right, modern liberals like T.H. Green. T.H. Green are supporters of welfare state. They are supporters of welfare state and believe in positive liberty. Welfare state and believe in positive liberty. This is just a small fodder for you because I know you'll be able to expand. When you mention positive liberty, you can always contrast it with the negative liberty in the previous instance of classical liberals. Again, you have more points to expand on. So this is again making your same points more specific. We've already written the state is minimal, but you can say the state is minimal both in the case of classical liberals and the neoliberals, but not in the case of modern liberals. Modern liberals wanted the state to have welfare provisions, more of Keynesian economics. Okay. Now, just write the overall conclusion for this, and then we move to the next particular part, right? The conclusion, right? Right, the liberal theory constructs the state, right? Liberal theory constructs the state as the protector of individual freedom. The liberal theory constructs the state as the protector of individual freedom and a facilitator of markets. Protector of individual freedom and a facilitator of markets. Protector of individual freedom and a facilitator of markets. But modern debates show that neutrality is difficult. The modern debates show that neutrality is difficult in structurally unequal societies. Structurally unequal. So, if the state still wants to be neutral, let's say when there is widespread inequality, this will lead to more challenges. Which is why in the modern times, you are seeing the state is balancing both the roles. It wants to support free market, at the same time it wants to reduce inequalities. How would it reduce inequalities? It would have to provide for some affirmative action, some relief packages, etc. And that becomes a very tricky part. Because if the state does more of welfare role, state will go in debt. The markets will say you are distorting the prices, you're not letting us be independent. But if the state is too much pro-market, Challenge क्या होगा? It will lead to more and more inequalities, more debates between the people, more revolution and the chances of it. That is a very tricky balance to have, right? That is the challenge, which is why even when there was, let's say, the modern welfare state, it was criticized by neoliberals, saying that the state is intervening in the market, and we want the market fundamentalism back. But the moment there was, let's say, global financial crisis, or let's say with the onset of COVID-19 and even beyond, what happened? Now you want both the welfare part as well as the free market part. That is a tricky rope to balance on. And this is again something we will again explore when I discuss with you neoliberal theory of state. Because neoliberal theory of state is the most, let's say, the modern part. And it has to walk this tightrope, the balance between these two conflicting ideas. Okay? Fine. Now, so we've written this, that it is difficult in these unequal societies, full stop, the last line, right? Yet its principles like its principles like constitutionalism, rights, checks and balances, remain foundational for modern democracies. Foundational for modern democracies. Remain foundational for modern democracies. Okay, so this I think we've done. Now, right, the neoliberal theory of state. A lot of simple overlap is going to be there, but there have been instances of specific, let's say, questions are being asked from this topic. So we should again have an idea of how to write an answer on this, right? Neoliberal theory of state, write separately. Of course, I'll be talking about these two people also. So let me write the heading. Again, see, let me erase it, I'll write it later. Now, see, neoliberal theory of state. Always remember the context, right? See, what is the context? The context was, it was against nanny state or a welfare state, because these nanny state and welfare state, these had become too big, right? The state had become very interventionist, right? Welfare, etc. So it was, let's say, taking away some people's freedom. And what is that? Let's say you are rich, you're working very hard. Now state is saying, no, I'll tax you even more. So the neoliberals say, you are taking away my freedom, right? The context is this. And it is this time, so again, in the 70s and 80s, the idea started and this was seen. Again, think of Thatcher, Reagan. They started to talk about that market fundamentalism is needed, okay? Or again, they'll talk about roll back the state, limit the power of the state, right? Now, who have been talking about a neoliberal theory? So politically, yes, these two people. But if I say thinkers, at least some prominent thinkers I'll tell you. So of course, one is Hayek, then there is Nozick. And by the way, Nozick is very popularly known for his entitlement theory also. By the way, he's given an entitlement theory of the state, right? Friedman. All these people, these thinkers, what have they highlighted? So if I say the core of neoliberal theory of state, core again goes back to what? Market fundamentalism, something which Adam Smith also spoke about, that This should be market fundamentalism, right? So that happens to be one of the core points that they say. Second point they also highlight, apart from this, is ultimately that state ultimately should come back and be a night watchman. Again, they will focus on maximum individual liberty, because if the state does progressive taxation, again we've seen terms like social justice is a mirage, progressive taxation is a bonded labor, again the works of these thinkers, right? And a direct visible application, where do we see? So again in thinkers, and again I'm just, if you set a context, a mixture of this I'll tell you. So John Williamson came up with 11 points, okay, seen in the Washington Consensus and ultimately through WTO, etc. Again the whole idea of neoliberal state is propagated, and when I say neoliberal state, it gets exemplified even through LPG and ultimately through globalization, which is why many times when the word globalization is mentioned, they will also write neoliberal state. So ultimately neoliberal state what talks about market fundamentalism, that state has no business to be in business. State ultimately should be a night watchman as imagined by classical liberals. And if you want to say, sir, is classical liberalism the same as neoliberalism? The simple answer is no, although there are many similarities. Why? The very simple thing, the context of both the times are very different. So initially you had classical liberalism, which was almost replaced by, let's say, modern liberalism, which was again, there was a call that the state is becoming more powerful, the markets are not able to express themselves, state should lower its control, market should be able to determine the prices, people's liberty should not be curtailed by the rising power of state, individuals should again get back the liberty. That is the core cause of neoliberal theory of state. So John Williamson's the 11 points, etc. And this you can also write in your margins. You can read more. WTO and all these topics you also see in GS3 economy, just for your reference. And by the way, WTO we also see in paper 2A. Okay, but again I'm telling you, what was the context? What were the thinkers? What are their core ideas around this particular part? Right? So market fundamentalism, but that is why we always say it is similar, but again you cannot use the terms interchangeably because context is very different. Neoliberal state is a more recent phenomena. Fine. So it will talk about all the core aspects. These are very important. But you also know it is criticized. Too much focus, or if the state, let's say, takes or reduces its role. If the state's role is reduced, what will be the problem? The problem will be inequalities will start to rise. Haven't we seen inequalities rising? We have seen. Think of Oxfam report. Think of Thomas Piketty. Thomas Piketty again in his book, Capitalism in the 21st Century. And if I have not told you yet, Thomas Piketty is also known as modern Marx. And he has done a great empirical, very quantitative research on how the inequalities are increasing in globalization. And for us, globalization is a manifestation, and it shows to us the neoliberal state. In simple words, I can say the rich are getting rich, the poor are getting poorer. Right? This is again a challenge in this society. So our idea is to ensure that we understand this whole part and then we express it. Core part to understand what will be the criticisms. One, again, Marxist criticism, rising inequalities leading to discontent. Right? Similar feminist criticism will be that it does not address the cause of women fairly well. Right? So this you can then understand. Overemphasis on economic part, individuals, less focus on society and welfare and human dignity. These will always be the criticisms. And this is seen right now in the modern context also. That when we talk of COVID-19, 2008 financial crisis, they were a huge existential crisis on the existence of neoliberal state. Because it was then again felt that state has to have an important role in very core affairs. These affairs cannot be left only to the market, that we assume that the markets will be able to take control and they will lead to all the things getting better. So that is something you will think of this part here, right? Broadly speaking, I think conceptually you will be able to understand. Many times I've seen, again, especially in these topics, people may not have enough clarity. Okay, so idea is understand this very well. Okay, and the writing part may be only focus on the essence of what we are writing. if you read it and be thorough, first of all, listen very carefully what we are saying, okay? In fact, just let's say if I take one more minute, that when you see any of these lectures, right, if you focus, and I've almost divided it explanation and then write-ups, explanation, write-up, explanation, write-up, always focus on the explanation. And even when you are writing, sometimes, but because you are writing, you may not be able to reflect on it. So after you are done seeing the lecture, and when you reflect back on the individual lines, any keyword you're not able to understand, either Google it if it is very simple. And if there is again a confusion, let's say, sir, I read something else in some other topic, this thing, can you help me get more clarity? You can ask. But the point is reflection. The more we reflect on these topics, it will get easier. And over a period of time, the more you revise it, just that you will need to know certain key facts and let's say factual elements, understanding you will have. Okay, the people who are following this, let's say over a period of time, you will feel, nahin, this is very easy to explain because I will be relating all these concepts to you. Fine. So that is one. Fine. So again, that is generally what this theory and particular part talks about, right? Okay. So a couple of points I think we can write here. Okay, so let's also have a write-up here overall. Right? The neoliberal theory of state emerged in the late 20th century as a reaction against Keynesian interventionism. Use this keyword if possible. Reaction against Keynesian interventionism, as a reaction against Keynesian interventionism, and the expansion of the welfare state, right, influenced by thinkers such as you can write F. Hayek, that is Friedrich Hayek, Robert Nozick, and Milton Friedman, neoliberalism argues that excessive state intervention distorts markets, inhibits competition, and undermines individual freedom. Full stop, right? Therefore, the state must be restructured. And not enlarged. The state must be restructured and not enlarged. Okay, now we will write few principles in point-wise manner, and then I'll come back to the paragraph-wise format. Right, point-wise manner again help you recall things faster. So here, write the core principles or core themes of neoliberal theory. Core themes of neoliberal theory. Core themes or core principles of neoliberal theory. Again, almost these points you will understand, self-explanatory. Now, number one makes sense that it is minimal economic role of the state. Minimal economic role of the state, right? Which basically means, see, should the state be there? Yes, in some cases, simply like the state should be there for contract enforcement, ensuring rule of law, ensuring ease of doing business. But it is again a very popular maxim that it's not state's business to be in business. Okay, so you have to minimal economic role of the state is what we imagine. Okay. Then second, of course, you can write is privatization. Right, in the private sector, privatization you can write. Put a dash in privatization and write state enterprises are inefficient. State enterprises are inefficient, whereas private sector drives innovation and efficiency. Okay. Third, right, deregulation. Deregulation. Put a dash. See, we know what is regulation, right? Deregulation means you remove the excessive control of the government. So in deregulation, right, put a dash. Right, removal of license controls. Removal of license controls, comma, labor restrictions, comma, financial regulations, and trade barriers. Removal, I'm saying, removal of license controls, labor restrictions, financial regulations, trade barriers. So one is minimal economic role of the state, second is privatization, next is deregulation. Fourth, you can write overall free markets and free trade. Free markets and free trade. Okay. Then another important point for it is redefinition of welfare. Redefinition of welfare. So right, shift from universal welfare, to targeted, comma, minimal safety nets. If you give too big of a safety net, state's role is increasing. So they're saying don't go for universal, even if you have to go very targeted, very precise, minimal safety net, so that state's commitment is limited. Earlier, if the state commitment is very high, let's say state says I will go for universal basic income, the biggest issue is it will cause a huge fiscal debt. Largely, don't you see in the neoliberal theory there is a lot of focus on economic aspect. Yes, there is, right? Okay. Now let's come back. So we have seen some of the core points. Now we'll put it in a proper paragraph, right? Now, right? Neoliberalism, neoliberalism does not advocate, neoliberalism does not advocate a passive, it does not advocate a passive night watchman state. It does not advocate a passive night watchman state, full stop, right? Instead, it proposes a market enabling, instead, it proposes a market enabling and regulatory state, market enabling and regulatory state that secures property rights, that secures property rights, comma, ensures rule of law, ensures rule of law, comma, maintains sound money, maintains sound money, comma, dismantles monopolies, dismantles monopolies and creates conditions for free competition, and creates condition for free competition, creates condition for free competition, condition for free competition. Full stop, right? Hayek condemned central planning. Hayek condemned central planning for leading to authoritarianism, for leading to authoritarianism, while Friedman, while Friedman while Friedman promoted privatization, privatization, comma, trade liberalization, so I'll repeat, Friedman promoted privatization, trade liberalization and deregulation to enhance efficiency and individual choice, to enhance efficiency and individual choice, to enhance efficiency and individual choice. Efficiency and individual choice. Efficiency and individual choice, full stop. Then write next paragraph, right? A decisive contribution, a decisive contribution came from John Williamson. I think would have mentioned the 11 points, etc. A decisive contribution came from John Williamson, John Williamson, who articulated the Washington Consensus 1989, who articulated the Washington Consensus 1989. Put a dash, right? A 10 point. Okay, so I think I've written 11 points, make it 10. A 10-point reform package. A 10-point reform package, including, see, main thing is, in this, what is talked about, and this will ultimately have a bearing on neoliberal theory of state. Right? 10-point reform package, including fiscal discipline, comma, tax reform, and all these words that we have seen: fiscal discipline, comma, tax reform, comma, trade liberalization, trade liberalization, comma, privatization, comma, FDI openness, and financial deregulation. Okay. So these are the points that we can write here: tax reform, financial discipline, trade liberalization, privatization, FDI openness, okay, and financial deregulation. Full stop, right? This became the global blueprint. This became the global blueprint for neoliberal reforms. For neoliberal reforms through IMF, World Bank structural adjustment programs, through IMF and World Bank, World Bank structural adjustment programs. And by the way, see, this consensus came in 1989. Before this, Reaganomics and the Thatcheronomics, we've already seen that earlier also, so I'm not repeating that. In case you still want to make that connection, in the margins, again write that. Okay, Reaganomics and Thatcheronomics, Tina and all of that, I've already explained it to you earlier, right? So that particular point can be added, fine. But here, this John Williamson point, back then I had not told you specifically in this detail. That is why we are writing it separately and specifically, right? So Reagan, USA, Thatcher, UK, their parts were already there, but this is a more, let's say, precise historical fact which led to Washington Consensus, the reforms, right? So, right, it also resonated with, so what we've written, it served as a, or it was, it promoted the neoliberal reforms through the IMF, World Bank, structural adjustment programs, full stop, right? It also resonated with and built upon, the earlier neoliberal reforms of 1980s, such as, so again, so let me include this only, such as Reaganomics, and Thatcheronomics. Reaganomics and Thatcherism. Thatcherism, and was later reflected in India's 1991 LPG reforms, and was later reflected in India's 1991 LPG reforms. Full stop, then write, change paragraph. The neoliberal state thus promoted FDI, that is foreign direct investment, FDI, comma PPP, public private partnership, FDI, comma PPP, comma independent regulators, comma targeted welfare, and global economic. When I'm saying targeted welfare, so we've made a contrast. Targeted welfare against universal welfare. Universal welfare will be very costly. So it is saying it is very precise and targeted. Okay, targeted welfare and global economic integration. Global economic integration. Right? Global economic integration. Full stop. Now, second last paragraph. This paragraph is specifically on the criticism part, right? However, neoliberalism faces strong criticisms. Neoliberalism faces strong criticisms. Full stop, right? Scholars like Thomas Piketty, in the bracket, if you want, you can write Capitalism in the 21st Century, the name of his book. Scholars like Thomas Piketty show that market-driven growth, and you should remember this line now. I'll be using it in many other topics also, even in 2A, in globalization, in other areas. In fact, even in GS3, you will see similar points being mentioned in economy, because globalization mein, the biggest critique is of the Marxists, let's say Thomas Piketty. So scholars like Thomas Piketty, Capitalism in 21st Century, show that market-driven growth widens inequalities. Market-driven growth widens inequalities. Full stop, right? Deregulation has contributed to financial crisis. Deregulation has contributed to financial crisis. In the bracket, you can write 2008. Comma, while privatization has weakened labor security. In the margins, write a term, let's say gig economy, and sometimes there is a term known as Uberization of workforce. So here, what is the issue? Hire and fire, no security of tenure. So while gig economy does give flexibility, okay, more of freelance work, but then the nature of the work may not be very long term. That may be a challenge. Okay, so right, while privatization has weakened labor security and public welfare. And public welfare. Full stop, right? Critics argue that Critics argue that neoliberalism leads to corporate capture. Neoliberalism leads to corporate capture, erosion of democratic accountability, and hollowing out of the state. It leads to corporate capture, erosion of democratic accountability, and hollowing out of the state. Okay? And use this term if you can. Hollowing out of the state. Right? So when I'm saying the state becomes hollow, so state, let's say the state was this much earlier, it is being hollowed out. It is reducing. That is a challenge. Hollowing out of the state. Okay, full stop. Then the last line, right? Although influential, neoliberalism, is increasingly challenged. It is increasingly challenged in a world witnessing renewed industrial policy. In this, again in the margins, think of fourth industrial revolution. Let's say with more automation, with the rise of robots, think of the people also, right? People, there will be more automation, which means lesser human jobs available, right? So how will we then tackle the overall labor markets, right? Second, the rise of, let's say, gig economy. What about labor protection, people, security of tenure, wages, employment? That part is also important. Okay. So witnessing a renewed industrial policy, comma, welfare expansion, comma, protectionism, and big tech regulation. These are all the new terms. Big tech. How to regulate the big tech? We have heard terms like FANG companies, let's say Facebook, Amazon, or GAFA, okay, Google, Amazon, Facebook, Apple. These are big companies, right? And these are technologically very superior. And sometimes it is said, because these countries, for example, if I say Apple, the market cap of Apple is sometimes way more than the combined GDP of many countries, right? These are very big, strong companies having transnational mode of operation, right? So when these companies are operating, in fact, while Apple is very prominent, much of its work, let's say, happens in Africa and other areas, right? Does it follow the standards of labor, proper payment? Because right now with globalization, we see exploitation of the third world economies. In many cases, they don't pay good amount of wages, yet the same product, when it is white labeled and then different ads and different brands are put, they're able to command a very high price in the market. This will be a challenge, right? So how to regulate that? Already deregulation may we saw global financial crisis. How equipped is the global economic system and individually the countries, that if there's again a foreign default, will they be able to withstand the shock? How strong are the macroeconomic fundamentals? How are they dealing with rising inequality? With this, again, think of Oxfam report. So in the context of inequality, you can always mention three things. Either the Gini coefficient, okay, you will read this again in economy, and it is, in case you're not aware, it is known as this GINI. You can read more about it, Gini coefficient, in case somebody does not know. Or I can talk about Oxfam reports and what it talks about inequality, okay. Or I can mention Thomas Piketty's work. I can use any of this to highlight the issue of inequality, etc. in the markets, okay, and then what to talk about it. So while it is influential neoliberalism, it is not without the criticism. That is the main point that we have tried to argue here in this case, right? So that is one. Now, till here, I think we've been able to follow, right? So now let us just have a look at what we've seen overall. So we had seen, I think, the liberal as well as the neoliberal theory of state. We've also seen in good detail, let's say, the origin of state, right? So the Marxist theory of state, now I think it will be better that if I cover it in the next part, right? Because I have a proper elaborate discussion on Marxist theory. So I think we will discuss Marxist theory in the next one, and followed by post-colonial and the feminist theory of state, right? So this is going to be the overall topic for discussion in the next class, right? I'll take your leave now. We'll meet again. Thank you.